All right, guys, whenever you're ready, we're live.
Okay, Sarah Linda, do you want to
I
provide
would,
an introduction?
I would love to. I was waiting for this opportunity. Welcome, everybody, to the virtual tour of landscape art and virtual travel. I'm Sarah Linda Lichtblau, Director of Education here at I'm actually here at the Hudson River Museum, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's program, which is being presented virtually. In the course of the next hour, you will have the pleasure of seeing our curator, Laura Vookles, our program manager, Olivia Cipriano, and our honored guest, artist Marcia Clark. Now, Laura Vookles and Marcia Clark are going to be sharing their thoughts about this exhibition as a whole, as well as selected individual works from the point of view of a curator and of an artist who is deeply immersed in the depiction of landscape and its spatial aspects. I think this is a very, very special conversation that the curator and artist will be having, and we are so happy to be able to present it on Zoom, which is an interactive medium, so that you can type your comments and your chats in and your questions in the chat box. And at the end of the presentation, Olivia will be facilitating the questions both on Zoom and on Facebook Live, to which we are currently streaming. So I'd like to get started first by introducing our special guest, Marcia Clark, whose work, Butterville Road Intersection, is featured in this exhibition. Marcia has exhibited at venues that include the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Museum of the City of New York, the Albany Institute of History and Art, Babcock Galleries, and the University of Rhode Island, to name a few. She has been a recipient of the Child Hassam Award, a National Endowment of the Arts Artist in Residence grant, and has written for Smithsonian Magazine, retracing the travels of Thomas Cole, first of the Hudson River School painters. And I look forward to hearing her commentary on Thomas Cole later on in the program. She was also guest curator for an exhibition of contemporary panoramas here at the Hudson River Museum, and is currently artist and director of Blue Mountain Gallery. Marcia has a BFA degree in painting from Yale University and an MFA degree from SUNY New Paltz. I am so pleased now to introduce Laura Vookles, who will bring on our guest, Marcia Clark, who is with us today. Enjoy.
Thank you, Sarah Linda. Could I have the next slide, please, Olivia? Well, besides that slide is just pointing out to everybody everything we just said about the fact that it's a Zoom presentation. So one of the things I wanted to point out about this exhibition right off the bat, which is has a little bit of a longer name than the name of the program. It's Landscape Art and Virtual Travel, Highlights from the Collections of the Hudson River Museum and Art Bridges. And this is the third year we've been in partnership with Art Bridges to bring amazing loans to the Hudson River Museum to invigorate our collection galleries and inspire us to reinterpret some of the objects that we have on view all the time, or get out new ones to bring to the collection gallery. And, you know, we're always at the Hudson River Museum thinking about our location, overlooking the river, the view that could you stay on the Jordan Matter, please, Olivia? The view that we have from the museum is not so different than this view by Jordan Matter of a dancer in Fort Tryon Park. And so, you know, we're always thinking about that. So when I chose to propose the loan that we would have, which you'll see in a minute by Cynthia Danio, I was thinking about how well it fit into our collection. And this was actually before the pandemic started. And we were all stuck at home, not spending as much time as we might like to traveling and seeing the landscape. And all of a sudden it seemed much more relevant even than before. And one of the things that was interesting in our research about the subject was we learned that there are studies that show that looking at pictures of beautiful landscapes, whether they're photographs like this or paintings, can have beneficial, emotional, mental, spiritual effects on us just as much as, or equal to, or almost equal to being outside. So it seemed like a really appropriate time to be looking at art. And landscape painters in America have been interested in depicting scenes like this from the very start. So one of the things, this is a view by Jordan Matter from a series called Dancers Among Us. And this dancer poised above the Hudson River, sort of striking a pose to reveal her sublime enjoyment of the situation. It also reminds me, though, of older 19th century paintings where a figure is often used as a surrogate of ourselves so that we imagine ourselves in the scene. Before we move on, was there anything you wanted to say about Jordan's work, Marcia?
No, just I'm looking at this view and wow, she's sort of on point and she's on edge and there's a steep drop.
It's very steep. It's about 100 feet. And she also happens to be a gymnast. So she was completely intrepid. But the photographer said that he had his assistant crouched below the wall out of the shot, as if the person could have done anything if she was overbalanced. But yes, we had a whole exhibition of Jordan's work a few years ago, and he donated this piece. Could we have the next slide, Olivia? So I just wanted to invite you to say a few words about your reaction, because you did visit the exhibition in person and are also in the exhibition. We didn't point out that the first slide we were showing when Sarah Linda was talking about you is your piece, Butterville Road Intersection. But why don't you tell us a little bit about your reaction to the show?
Well, I was thrilled when I saw the show. It was as though I had been invited to a special party that included friends from the 19th century, and or perhaps as though we were all on a pilgrimage together. The exhibition isn't large in size, though its scope is broad. You can see that there's a variety of work with related interests and concerns, and then many ways of expressing them. From my point of view, many of the artists have been creating or mapping entire panoramas in various media with their own time or distance progressions. Rashid and I guess you don't see him on this slide, actually
it is at the lower right, Marcia. Everyone, the lower right is the piece that she's talking about by Frohawk Two Feathers, Umar Rashid. Go on.
I don't see him, but I guess he's there. Anyway, Rashid and I actually employ maps in our work, but Don Nice documents his trip up the Hudson in a series of watercolors, a way of mapping. Dagneau maps the country by way of her 360 little oil paintings, and Mcilhenny's work travels the Hudson Valley. And you could say that Cole maps the span of human life in his Voyage of Life series. Of the four, youth is presented here. You can see it.
Yeah, in just a second, Olivia, if we could have the next slide. So I wanted to say a little bit about Cynthia Dagneau and her piece, Light Atlas, which does consist of these 360 paintings, which are about 8 by 10 inches. This is a piece that's on loan from Art Bridges. It is considered to be one artwork, and that is the artist standing in front of it. And you display the entire thing. And the way this came about is Cynthia Dagneau was in a conversation with someone, and it came up talking about artists, adventurers, and she could think of so many men who had traveled the American landscape from, Thomas Cole, Mark Twain, Bob Dylan, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, Frederick Church, and no women. We actually have an upcoming lecture about one of those women. There were women, but they're not as well known, like Eliza Greatorix. But she couldn't think of anyone, and it inspired her to go on her own adventurous journey. She drew a circle around the continental United States, and she traveled 30,000 miles and stopped every 27 miles to document an image that she would later paint a picture of. And she just means for you to get a swath of the country. She doesn't individually label the places that she stopped. You can kind of get a sense of the terrain changing as she moves through the landscape. And you feel like you're seeing the whole country, even though I guess, 360 stops is a pretty small amount of what she actually drove by. So it's pretty fascinating that way. And she picked 360 because that's the degrees of a circle. And she was basically making a circle around the United States. Next slide, please. And I think you had a few more things you wanted to say about Cynthia, right, Marcia?
Well, sort of. She's asserting equal rights for each part of the landscape by making these arbitrary stops. And they're beautifully painted in luscious, juicy color, as I think you're going to show a few more.
I do. I have a few details. Yeah.
Being able to give equal care to the 360 views seems to also involve a practice in equanimity. And to me, this is a great feat to give equal attention to each and equal value to each of them. And she's removing any hierarchic way of thinking here. It's down with the king.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you from the prairies to the desert to the mountains, you see it all. I mean, one thing I wanted to point out that I don't think Sarah Linda really stressed when she was introducing you is I've known Marcia for more than 30 years. In the 1980s, she curated an exhibition the museum had called The World is Round. And it was all about the different ways that artists can use to depict this very intricate world we live in. There's one point perspective from the Renaissance, but the world itself is round, as the title of the exhibition said. And so, Cynthia is using 360 paintings to get the point across of moving through the landscape. Next slide. And there's a couple last ones from her just to show the variety that you see. We are open to the public now. If you're able to come, you can come experience it firsthand. Next slide. So normally I mentioned that we use these artworks to reinvigorate our interpretation of our collection. And this is a really good example. This is Hiram Powers' Eve Disconsolate, also titled Paradise Lost of 1871. It is almost always on view for a few obvious reasons. One thing, it's not so easy to move a sculpture like this. Two, it's a very important artwork. And at first I thought, okay. And then I thought, wait a minute, this is Eve standing in the Garden of Eden. She is absolutely a figure in the landscape. So we were inspired to go with that. And I include the detail to show you how Hiram Powers used the stump that is necessary to support the marble figure to represent the landscape by showing the tree trunk and the ivy. He has the serpent. And it also gets across a point that we'll talk about in a second, that that artists can can paint imaginary landscapes. They don't have to be a real landscape. And so depending on your beliefs, the Garden of Eden is somewhat of an imaginary landscape, even if it existed. We don't know exactly what it looked like. And so that is a good lead in to Thomas Cole, who was also very interested in expressing religious sentiments in his landscapes. Next slide, please. So the museum has in our collection a set of prints that were engraved after paintings by Thomas Cole called The Voyage of Life. And this is what I was referring to, that often, particularly Thomas Cole, better known as the founder of the Hudson River School, and yet landscape before that time was often felt to be a more important artwork or a more important art form if there was some kind of heavy themes associated with the depiction of the landscape. And Thomas Cole really ascribed to that notion. And so even though he painted pure landscapes, he also painted these grand series that have a lot of symbolism in them. So in The Voyage of Life, which this is youth, there's childhood, youth, manhood, and old age, and I have pictures of them all in a second. he used the landscape as a metaphor for your passage through life. And so here the youth who is being bid adieu by the guardian angel doesn't realize that the placid river is in a minute going to be a tumultuous mountainous landscape where life is going to get more difficult. Paradise is visible in the sky, but it's not going to be that easy. Next slide. And so this is childhood, and the guardian angel bringing the baby out of the cave. I show the engraving in our collection, the painting at the National Gallery. Thomas Cole painted it. There's one set at the Munson Williams Proctor Institute in Utica and one at the National Gallery. Take it as you will, what the symbolism of a baby coming out of a cave might mean. And I know that Marcia has some things to say about Thomas Cole in this series. Do you want to talk a little bit about Thomas Cole, Marcia?
Oh, sure. Cole was an important mentor for me ever since I saw a retrospective of his work at the Whitney, and that was in 1969. I had recently moved to the Hudson Valley, and I was taken with familiar light and atmosphere that I saw in his paintings, and then later by his entire approach. I learned to observe more closely, and at the same time remembering the poetry. And Cole actually, to paraphrase Cole, he said, to walk with nature as a poet was the perfect condition for a painter. In any case, whether prose or poetry, you can present the sense of a place in a painting, but you're not making a pure transcription. Inescapably, the artist's values and intentions are embedded in the choices we make. In the 19th century, even Cole, who understood and bemoaned the damage that we were doing to the environment, was riding a wave of discovery. And he was bringing to the viewer the wonders of the American landscape that they were eager to see. But now we are really on a wave of concern, and to be sure, more urgently, well, more and more urgently, I've been painting in the Arctic in a way, watching the icebergs melt and the glaciers recede. If a viewer looks at the paintings and recognizes the fragile beauty of the Arctic, he or she may also feel my concern. We tend to be creatures of our time, but also our work does carry our values and speaks for them, although perhaps not always overtly. I don't know if we can go back to this view. So you have the castle in the sky, and you've got the forbidding mountain in this print of the painting. But the mountain is one that Cole had never seen. You can say that it was a fantasy mountain, but among his papers, I once noticed a somewhat crude sketch of the Cordilleras in Venezuela. It was marked as such. And these mountains resemble that rough sketch. It was by another hand, and since this was a place he had never seen, I thought how suitable for the youthful discovery that he's portraying, how suitable that he should be using a mountain that he had never seen for this youthful discovery.
Well, definitely, even when artists are creating imaginary landscapes, yes, they're referencing the actual that they may have seen either in person or in some kind of an illustration. If you want to go forward, Olivia, I have the other images in the series. So we have, childhood, then we have manhood, where things really get tough. The angel has abandoned him and he's going down some rapids next. And then we have old age, and the angel is back and he's about to be taken up to heaven. And you can see how Cole is using the landscape to convey these themes. And then I have in the next slide, one of Cole's more traditional landscapes, one of his more famous landscapes at the Metropolitan Museum, the Oxbow, which is an actual place in Northampton, Massachusetts. And Marcia, you might want to chime in a minute, but first I just wanted to point out this two-sided composition. In the real landscape, Cole has also employed this idea of like sort of the mountain, and you can't really see it, but there's a rocky outcropping where there's a tiny artist painting and looking over this valley. And in the valley, this painting has been interpreted so many ways over the years, but one way, as I mentioned, it's not in our exhibition, it's at the Metropolitan Museum, is that the valley has been clear cut. And so Cole may be admiring and yet also a bit perturbed about the landscape being disturbed. And then you have a similar two-part landscape in the print with, the close-up details on the left and on the right, and on the left, the distant view. Did you want to say anything else about the Oxbow, Marcia?
I think that when we see the Durand, that you'll see a similar
That's
composition.
true. Olivia, we can go on to the Asher B. Durand. Yeah, this was a very dear friend of Thomas Cole's, who lived longer than him. Thomas Cole, unfortunately, died very young in 1848. And then Asher B. Durand became sort of the unofficial titular head of the Hudson River School, and was much more likely to be sort of eschewing these kinds of symbolic narratives in the landscape and simply studying nature as it presented itself to him. Marcia?
I was just interested in the composition where he's got the mountains in the distance and the near landscape on the right, left and right, near and far. And he's sort of working with opposites. And I was reminded of the Oxbow when I saw this painting with its stormy mountain on the left side and the clearing in the valley on the right. I'm curious about the view he's chosen to paint. It seems that we've got, there's a question of whether this could be Crawford Notch or not. And
which is in the White Mountains.
The White Mountains of New Hampshire, right. And I think that a wide and distant view like this is an unusual take on the notch if you're in it. It may be possible, it may be another place, but perhaps while he was in this place that was still kind of wild, especially in the 19th century, I think, perhaps he was still yearning for his familiar pastoral settings that he's, I think, more known for.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that the museum has and other people who study Hudson River School art have studied over the years is the interrelation between these paintings and the development of tourism and collecting landscape paintings. And, one of the first places people would go a lot was the Catskills, just because it's so close. Even then, you could go on the steamboat or the train and then take a ferry across the river to the Catskills. But that got very filled up with tourists very fast, and people would go further away, like the White Mountains or the Green Mountains. And we know that Asher B. Durand did visit the White Mountains with Thomas Cole and later with Daniel Huntington. So sometimes it's just impossible to try and figure out where a landscape painting was made if the artist didn't title it, but we keep trying to do research on this and see if we can figure it out. Next slide. So one of the drawings that I included in the show is by Marie-Louise Baskin Revort, and this is very definitely, I believe, in the Green Mountains. Artists would often travel around in the in the Green Mountains of Vermont. She was up at Rutland. Artists would often travel around in the summertime and make sketches and then go back to the city in the wintertime, where they had access to their studios, to their regular life, to the art organizations, and then they would work on paintings. We don't know of any paintings. I don't know if anybody knows of any extant paintings by Louise Bascom, as she was then. She got married 2 years later to James Revort. But I liked showing this, and it's kind of a romantic story because we don't really know the circumstances under which these drawings were made, but in our collection we have the drawing by Marie and the drawing by her future husband, James Revort, painted where they must have been standing very, very close to each other. So it just is kind of interesting. And actually, I think, if you had to judge which one was more finely drawn, I don't know, it might be a tough one. And I just have to point out that right now the museum also has on a show called Women to the Fore, which is 150 years of women artists. But I did choose intentionally to put some pieces like Marcia's piece and this piece by Marie Revort up here in this show because they seemed so related to it. Next slide, please. And I mentioned tourists before, and one of the things I wanted to say a little bit about was about the tourist industry was also the advance in like book printing and illustration that took place during the 19th century. I mean, people really hungered for images, and advances in printing made it more possible for people to have access to even photography, but especially engraving. And one of the most lavish sort of, not really a travel book, but travel was done to create the illustrations that and the essays that went into it, was Picturesque America, which Appleton's put out in the 1870s. They sent artists and authors all over the country to sort of, champion the cause of how beautiful America was. Now we look at it and I'm struck by two things. I've been studying this book since college, actually. I did a presentation on it then. Is that some of the places people go were still the places back then. In Tennessee, they went to Rock City. People still go to Rock City in Tennessee. I'm from Tennessee. Or they went up the Hudson here. Harry Finn, who did a lot of the illustrations, was traveling up the Hudson River, and he illustrated Cossin's Hotel, which is where a lot of these tourists were staying. But when you read these essays these days too, and we could go to the next slide, a lot of what comes out in the subtext is how, in the best light, clueless, in the worst light, incredibly colonialistic, these artists and writers were in terms of thinking of the landscape as their manifest destiny. And, exploring, like Thomas Moran went with, expeditions into the Grand Canyon, and also went and depicted this engraving, The Cross in the Rockies, thought of themselves as the first people to see these sites, which, a whole program could be given on how much that was not true. But I know you wanted to say a little bit about Thomas Moran, Marcia.
Well, I really like this print.
It's beautiful. It's an etching. You see here the difference between an engraving, which is for a mass production, and an etching, which is more of a fine art print. Go on.
And I think that you had said that he was inspired to go here because of a photo that he saw by William Henry Jackson.
Yes.
And so he was standing right at the spot where Jackson had to do the photograph, and it's of the Mountain of the Holy Cross. But the thing that I like so much about this print is the water coming down toward us through the rapids. It seems to bring the mountain with it from a great distance. And there's an exciting shifting of planes that move forward that cascade forward with the cascade, as it were.
Right.
And he keeps everything in motion in a darkly bright atmosphere of dark brown printing ink. I don't think that this image does justice to the print. It's very rich.
No, it's very detailed. I mean, you can get so much detail into an etching for people that may not realize how they're made. I mean, an engraving, and on the left, this would be a wood engraving, and the artists themselves would not do it. They would turn in a drawing, and then craftsmen who worked for the publisher would be engraving, arduously with special, tools, the crevices that would, well, actually they would be carving the crevices and leaving up lines that would, hold the ink. in an etching, there's a wax ground on a copper plate, and the artist can just draw freely into the wax. It's very giving, and it can be much more fluid. And so there was a movement in the late 19th century when a lot of artists got involved in etching because it was something they could easily do themselves. They didn't have to have craftsmen who knew how to carve it to make it. And the lines can be very detailed. And then they would submerge the plate in an acid bath, which would like carve in the lines that where they had sketched away the wax. So, but there's so many things you could read into this. I mean, for one thing, this idea of tourism and that there is the spot that you're supposed to stand and see the view. And, as you said, this is the view that Jackson put in his photograph. This is the view that Moran came and looked at the scene. And this is probably the view that people go and stand at today. It becomes so sort of embedded. And then there's also the fact that it's this cross in the mountain, and there is this sense of religiosity left over from coal. People are looking to the landscape to find some kind of higher meaning. And then who doesn't love a waterfall? If you don't love waterfalls, put it in the chat or something, because I think there is just some kind of they're dramatic, they're beautiful, they're musical. We all seem to love waterfalls. Next slide, please. Let's see. Okay, so David Hockney is a British artist. He's been around for a long time, since the 1960s even, but he lives in LA. He's been in the United States for a long time. And this is a study that belongs to Art Bridges, which is for two massive murals, like room-sized paintings that David Hockney did of the Grand Canyon. He started by trying to make a photo collage based on photographs that he took, and he decided that wasn't visceral enough. You didn't feel like close enough. And in fact, the two final paintings, which are 25 feet wide, one is in a museum in Denmark and one's in the National Gallery of Australia. I think he calls them like a closer Grand Canyon and maybe a bigger Grand Canyon, because he got the sense that photography was not up to the task of conveying the feeling he felt when he was there at the Grand Canyon. And he made it out of little individual paintings. Partly that was practical. He said it was more practical to work on a small painting, more practical for the museums that owned these giant 25-foot paintings to store them and move them around. But it also has other interesting elements. And I know that you really responded to this, Marcia.
Yeah, and to Hockney in general, I would say he's someone else who's been important to me, somewhere maybe between an elder or a fellow traveler, and definitely an inspirer. Years ago, since my paintings were panoramic in scope, I had begun working on multiple panels, and I think maybe it was easier to focus. That way I could give each part its place, as opposed to trying to draw everything back to a particular vanishing point. But also, it's true, if you're working on something large, if you have smaller parts to carry around, it's much more convenient. But that's another aspect. Anyway, seeing Hockney's work and hearing his thoughts about alternatives to traditional perspective helped me, I think, to be stronger in my conviction about following an alternative route. And I also admire how he's able to make use of technology to develop and enlarge on his ideas. In this painting, you're looking down and in, but also up and out to the distance. Since Hockney has shifted his focus, you're having to take the time to let your eyes travel through the landscape to explore. By splitting the painting into 15 parts, Hockney further disrupts its unity. Collaging elements together as he's done, he's opened up the landscape. So you're able to roam instead of being directed to vanishing points, and the distance comes forward to meet your gaze instead.
Yeah, and one thing I should point out that is not always apparent in slideshows virtually like this is a really large painting, even though it's a study. It's about 6 feet square. And, you know, just speaking for Hockney and also just for the notion of the Grand Canyon, which is a very overwhelming, as they would have called in the 19th century, sublime experience.
Mhm.
People stop at this. I've been watching people in the galleries walking through the exhibit, and they are absolutely arrested by this painting. They definitely stop and really take it in. And he said in an interview that one reason he didn't include figures in it, like the figure, you know, in Jordan Matter's photograph or in 19th century paintings, is that he wanted you to be there yourself, like you standing there are the figure, and he didn't want to have that intermediary aspect. We should probably keep going. So one of the things we were really thinking about a lot, as I alluded to when I was talking about the book Picturesque America, was the ways in which a lot of the ways artists and even people today were looking at the landscape reflect this sense of manifest destiny, that somehow it was the right of the colonists to just take over the United States and lands that had belonged to other people for eons. And so, you know, we really wanted to make sure that other voices are in the exhibition. And one of the artists I had the joy to meet and work with and participate in the exhibit is Jeremy Dennis, who is part of the Shinnecock Nation out on Long Island. There is a Native American reservation out on Long Island. And Jeremy Dennis has done a whole project called On This Site. He's traveled around Long Island documenting in these beautiful photographs sites that have cultural significance for his people. Some of them are sacred, others just represent sites that you know, where there were villages, where there was historically something. What he said about Ashawag is that it was a pre-contact Montaukett settlement on the edge of Copaces, I think it's called Hands Creek, and that shell heaps in the area suggest intense wampum manufacturing, and it was especially important for hunting, fishing, and camping. So through his eyes, we're able to travel back to the past. You know, it's another kind of virtual traveling we can do and see the New York metropolitan region and Long Island with different eyes. Next slide. Keeping it moving. So, you know, paying attention to the time. I mean, this is one of my favorite works in our collection by Alison Mortsugu. She has done a lot of painting of landscapes, generally imaginary landscapes, but inspired by traditional art on logs, sections of logs, as in here, entire logs. And it's really very multifaceted. I mean, I think I'll let Marcia tell you how she responded to it, which is exactly how Alison means you to respond to it.
Huh. I think for her, the log represents evidence of destruction, but there's so much more to the narrative she weaves. It doesn't read simply as a dead, discarded thing. I'm looking at the coarseness of the surface of the log, contrasted with the delicacy of the landscape. It's an arresting combination and a terrific study in contrast. I can see the log as symbolic of the destruction of the forest, and the irony presented by the paintings that have come out of a colonial culture. But the startling thing is the landscape becomes the eyes of the log, and they suggest a universe in this one lifeless thing. There's an interesting tension here as you read life back into the log. I think the piece has a really magical.
Yeah, and I love the way you said that it was like the eyes of the log, because another thing that I was sort of imagining in an Alice in Wonderland kind of way is that maybe you were peering into the log, you know, like a ship in a bottle or something. But you know, I just I really love her work. And to give you some sense of scale, the object is about like this. you know, it's a substantial size, but fairly small. Next slide, please. And then I did want to include Richard Mayhew, another favorite from the collection. Richard Mayhew is, he doesn't paint specific landscapes. They're rather spiritual. It reminds me of George Inness, a 19th century painter whose landscapes were very generalized, but meant to reflect his spiritual sense of the landscape. In his case, a very different. He was interested in Emanuel Swedenborg. But Richard Mayhew, it has African-American and Native American heritage, and he has talked a lot about the spiritual significance of the landscape for his cultural heritage. And that's part of his attraction to the landscape. And it's very ethereal. It's very, I really just love this work. It's about 3 feet by 3 feet, maybe 2.5 feet by 2.5 feet. It's substantial, so you can really sort of get lost in contemplating it. Could we have the next slide, please? Oh, this is definitely a favorite. I had the opportunity to meet Don Nice a couple of times. We've had a few shows at the museum over the years. I mean, Don Nice, I'm very interested in the generation of artists in the 1960s who sort of intentionally turned away from the abstract expressionism and minimalism that were prevalent at the time and re-embraced the landscape. And part of what turned that trend, I think, was the bicentennial and people sort of looking again at sort of, I really hate to use this term, but what made America great in a different way. But people were looking at the American landscape, and Don Nice was definitely in that generation. Sadly, he passed away last year. And in 1999, he traveled up the Hudson from New York, as far, I guess, as he could go in the small boat he was in. I think his daughter might be on the call and could write in the chat if she knows how far he got on that journey. And at the beginning of his journey, he actually invited our contemporary curator at the time to travel with him up. I think she stayed on the boat about as far as she could get back home on the train, which was probably Poughkeepsie. And I just remember, and her name's Ellen Kiter. She's the curator at the Eric Carle Museum now. And she wrote, we had a show of the series of works he did. This is Mount Hook in Rockland County. And she wrote this very sensory text panel about it that was very unusual for the period. Curators are always writing about things in third person. And she talked about being on the boat and the water sloshing, and Don liking that the boat was shaking and really feeling a sense of the place. I mean, really this idea of being on the river, not on the banks looking at the river. And I highly recommend, as a curator of a museum that's on the river, but also just as a person, if you've never been out on the Hudson River and you have the opportunity to be out on a boat on the Hudson River, it's a very different way of experiencing the landscape. And I know you have a few things to say about Don Nice, Marcia.
Well, I think that you've pretty much covered it. Thank you.
Okay. I mean, but it's, one of the things, and maybe I hope I'm getting it across, is that a lot of these artists, they have a different way of looking at the world. They all have their own way of saying, this is the world I'm standing in. How do I want to convey that for people that might view my art? And so Don Nice is out on a boat in the middle of a river, and let's see who's coming next. Olivia. Okay, so last fall we had an exhibit by James Mcilhenny, who takes a note from the explorer artists of the 19th century and travels around and records his views in tiny, like if you've seen those little like moleskin notebooks that you buy at fancy stationery stores. And he, instead of just doing sketches preliminary to something else like the 19th century artists did, he makes these finished paintings on this tiny scale, like whatever scale you're looking at it on your computer, this is about life size. And he's very interested in the interaction between the sense of place and the history of the place and how he's going to depict it now, and that thoughtfulness that goes with that. I mean, think about how you use your phone today. Everywhere you go, it's in your hand. You're just like, oh, snapshot here, snapshot there. In the 19th century, if you were on a trip and you thought a flower was pretty on an alpine path, you had to sit down and make a sketch of it. And many people practice that in a very amateur way, just because they didn't necessarily have cameras. The first, mass produced, cameras for amateurs were in the 1890s. And I think that you really responded to James's work and had a few things to say, Marcia.
Yeah, and a lot of it is about taking a look at what he's done with his red archival pen, looking at the marks and that you can see almost throughout the painting, but especially in the distance here. Anyway, with a drawing or a watercolor, you can more easily follow in the artist's footsteps. They're fresh and direct often, as this one is, and reveal the process to you. And here the red marks of the archival pen delineating the rock formations are like another player. They give a kind of armature for our own building of the scene in our minds. Just as it took him time to make the marks, they slow us down, and we too can take the time in our own reconstruction of his view. We don't see it all at once, but through time.
I mean, and I have to say, and if you'll show the next slide, Olivia, I mean, this is how art can affect your life, because, I work right across the river at the museum in Yonkers. Mm-hmm. And I was inspired by talking to James and how easy it is to go over to State Line Park in New Jersey, to just drive over there myself. And I took this photograph probably from almost the exact spot where James was painting. And I highly recommend it to everyone. And it would probably be a really easy and nicely socially distanced outing in this time we're in, to just drive over there. It's right off the Palisades Parkway. And this is not even a hike, it's like 100 yards from the parking lot. You walk over to the edge of the Palisades and see this view. Next slide. And I just wanted to give you a sense of, what some other views in the same, actually James donated this sketchbook to us, which is all scenes of his travels up and down the Hudson River. And this is a view from Boscobel that's in the same sketchbook. Next slide. So another really fascinating piece we have in the collection and in the show is by Frohawk Two Feathers. And this is part of a series in which Frohawk Two Feathers, which is the nom de plume of Umar Rashid, he created a whole alternative history of the Hudson River. Sort of what would have happened if it wasn't just that the English won everything? What if maybe the French or the Native Americans had come out on top? He's got this whole story going on where there's a pharaoh of the region, and these figures on his scene are, Bonnie, Prince Johnny, the pharaoh. And then he's taking a map, which we tend to regard as a factual thing, and he's created a fictional hybrid of a real map of the Hudson River Valley with his fictional circumstances. And it reminds me, and this will be a segue into Marcia talking about some of her other work, that a map is another way of viewing the landscape. And it is its own kind of abstract artistry that we put upon what we're looking at. It's not like the map is really there. We still have to use a lot of art and science and imagination to come up with these maps that depict what we're seeing. Right, Marcia?
Mm-hmm.
So next slide. And this is just a detail. It's just really a lot of like really fun details based on 18th, 17th century maps would have these little side details and show you there were monsters there. But I recently watched a program during COVID about some of these maps that talked about how showing monsters in some of these locations was meant to scare off other explorers and would-be colonizers, because the monsters would show that you shouldn't be brave enough to go there. Next slide, please. So I wanted you to say a few words before closing, Marcia, about this amazing work that you donated to the collection. I think now that we've been through some of the ways of looking at space and landscapes while we've been talking about the other artworks, people will have a better basis for understanding what you're doing here in the Butterville Road intersection. And then we actually have a treat at the end, some pieces that aren't in the show that are your work depicting your Arctic expeditions.
Okay. This is the intersection of Butterville Road and the Route 299. It's a place that's familiar to me and close to where I lived for many years. I lived on Butterville Road. The intersection is at a spot on the road where you can see the trajectory leading from the town to the mountains. So I wanted to convey the experience of being in a space that surrounded me. And since this was an intersection, I thought, why not paint looking in each of the four directions and then down to the pathway, connecting each of them for me, the place where I stood. It was especially satisfying to place the map of the area below, or as you see it on the wall, behind the painting. This was another layer, a kind of plan or prototype, adding science, measured distance, and topography to my own responses, but with the painting casting a shadow. A map for me tends to suggest an unchangeable fact, which is one of the reasons I find Rashid's painting so delightful, the Frohawk Two Feathers piece that you saw before this. But the maps we use also get rethought and redrawn. It isn't as if there's anything that doesn't change. Movement and fluidity are important concepts to me, and I aim for them in what I do.
And in case people can't tell, this is actually a dimensional piece. We have a plexi box around it because it's as if the box is unfolding. You know, imagine, how you make a box with like 6 sides, you're standing in it and then it's starting to be unfolded around you. And so all those 4 pieces are leaning up. And this piece was after you did some similar pieces in Iceland, right, Marcia? I think we, well, I think first we're going to talk about the Arctic, I think is the next slide. And is this you? I didn't ask you before. Is this kayaker you or someone else?
This is the woman sitting in front of me, or in the kayak in front of me. I was lucky. I was in a 2-person kayak, and it was the guide that was with me, and I let him do most of the work while I was taking this video. So the images are taken from the video.
I don't think I would want to fall out of a kayak in Alaskan waters.
No.
But so this is an example of you using a map in combination with other imagery.
Yes, the map of the world from the point of view of the Arctic.
All right. Next slide, please. You said this one kind of kicked off your interest in the Arctic, right?
Well, I was in Newfoundland. I was on a residency, and I made a trip to a place where Frederick Church had gone to see the icebergs. And it's a place that's still known for icebergs, but that season there were no icebergs to be seen. And I asked people what had happened. I mean, yes, climate warming, but the explanation I got from people was that the wind must have diverted them as they were coming down from Greenland. And so I decided that really had to go to Greenland if I wanted to see icebergs. But this painting is done on Denril, which is translucent. And while I was in Newfoundland, I was traveling a lot and I was using maps. And this is a map of the area I was in. And I happened to drop the painting down on top of the map. And so this was for me a happy accident. And it was an early experiment with using maps.
Well, I think the next slide is Greenland.
Yes.
Yeah. Should we go to the next one, which is more like icebergs, I think, or ice? Yeah.
Sure.
Do you want to tell us something about this ice fjord? Were you on a cruise, or what were you doing? When you go there, where do you paint?
Ilulissat has one of the biggest ice fjords with the most ice that comes from it. And this ice fjord happens to be right outside the town. So it's a very convenient place to, if you want to stay in Ilulissat, you're very near the fjord and the icebergs. And so I've actually spent a lot of time there on and off over the years since my first visit in 2007.
Do you want to show us the next slide, Olivia? So now we're finally back to Iceland and the piece that preceded the Butterfield Road, right?
I'm not sure what the order was. I think I brought the pieces of Butterville Road with me on this trip.
Oh yeah, they have the same date. They're both 2011, it says.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're kind of at the end here. I just wanted people to see that, when you gave us the Butterfield Road piece, you mentioned that you had been experimenting with this technique also in these pieces from Iceland. I mean, do you have to stop in Iceland to get to Greenland? Is that how you ended up in Iceland?
Unless you want to go from Copenhagen, but it's a long trip to go to Europe in order to get to Greenland, which is really so close by.
Well, if anybody has any questions for Marcia or me, I have noticed a few comments in the chat. And before I turn it over to Olivia, I'll just say I noticed that Don Nice's daughter, Leslie, is on the call. And she said that he went as far as Tear of the Clouds, which means he went to the bitter end, because when they wrote Picturesque America, they had not yet discovered Tear of the Clouds, which is the source of the Hudson. And they have an engraving that says that these guys are standing at the source of the Hudson, and it's really not. It was discovered later that was not the real source of the Hudson. And Sarah Linda was just pointing out various details that interest print nerds like me about how wood engravings were actually enabled there to be illustrated books where the illustrations were printed on the same page as the type, but that is a very erudite discussion for another day. Somebody was saying, Sarah Linda was saying, but maybe you've answered this question. What inspired you to explore the ice fields? But maybe you already answered that question. She said, are you aware of Frederick Church's painting of the icebergs? And then Olivia, I'll leave the question asking to you after this.
Well, it goes back to, I think it's too long a story to tell here. It started with painting a glacier for a display at the Mount Washington Observatory without ever having been to a glacier, and having it haunt me. I did lots of study to come up with the painting, but it haunted me. And and I read John Muir's books, and I read about his discovery of Glacier Bay. And the first place I went when I finally started my explorations was to Glacier Bay in Alaska.
Cool.
Well, I want to come on your next trip.
Yeah, I'm impressed that you've been on these places. Oh my gosh. Is there anything else, Olivia, that people are asking?
Sarah was curious about the cross depicted in cross in the Rockies. So I'm skipping to that slide right there by Thomas Moran. Is there actually a cross in the face of the mountain? And if so, do we know how it was created? Was it man-made?
I think it's a natural formation. I think it was one of those things that 19th century explorers looked at and wanted to read some kind of spiritual significance in it. And you can make many inferences of that spiritual significance. It could just be general. It could be that they also saw it as a sign that Christians were meant to be here in the Rockies. I'm just saying, I haven't read a lot about it, but that might have been part of it. But I think it was this desire to see some kind of religious significance in the American landscape. A lot of the language at the time would talk about how it was untouched by the hand of man. This is where I meant that today we see this with more nuanced eyes. If they're saying things like this is untouched by the hand of man, today we know that is entirely not true. So because if it was untouched by the hand of man, then they're kind of equating that with the Garden of Eden. And if they see a cross formation, that the snow is sort of sitting in this cross formation, they want to read something into it.
I just wanted to mention, I do believe that is a natural formation. But if we go back to Thomas Cole's The Oxbow, there is in the mountain in the far distance, some people contend that there is a reference to the Old Testament in that some people discern Hebrew lettering in.
Oh, I think I have. You mean that
right.
one like in sort of the center, like slightly
Yes.
right of center?
Exactly. You see that the lighter sections, you can't see my pointer, but anyway.
No, but I see what you mean.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's,
I don't know Hebrew, but I take your word for it. And I have.
Yeah. I just, people read things into the landscape. And so it's just very interesting. It's not the only symbol. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Anything else, Olivia?
Roberta has been posting a couple of links into our group chat. One is for Jordan Matters website, and one is the nga.gov collection art object page. I'm not sure. Let me see which one this is.
Maybe the National Gallery of Arts.
Yes, it's the Mountain of the Moran Mountain of the Holy Cross piece.
Oh, okay.
That she shared with us as well. So if you guys are interested in those, you can go take a look, which is pretty interesting. So thank you, Roberta. As of on Facebook, we do not have anything currently or up there, any comments right now, but they might come in later after.
Well, it is 2:33, so maybe people are winding down and have no questions. But while people are deciding if they have any questions, either Sarah Linda or Olivia, do you want to give us a sense of upcoming things? And I want to thank Marcia. Thank you so much for joining us. And because it's always is a special insight to hear an artist talk about their own work, and also to have insights about other works that a curator might not necessarily notice. Somebody did just ask a question.
Janet is asking, Marcia, do you do many studies and later decide which to use and fold up the pictures, or plan for ahead?
Both.
Okay, a short answer.
Yeah, I love the idea, Marcia, of happy accident. When you show the map, and and it takes an artistic sensibility to take advantage of those moments, and not just dismiss them as, oh, this is a mistake. No, this is an opportunity.
In that case, the colors in the map were in my painting, and so I couldn't notice.
Okay.
That's so great.
Yeah, and I also want to remind people that we are open. You don't have to make an advance reservation to come. You can come see the exhibition. And as I said in the introduction, studies have shown that looking at scenes of nature is beneficial to your health and your psychology. And I'm not sure whether Sarah Linda or Olivia is planning to talk about future things we have upcoming.
Yeah, I do have a couple things to mention, and you can come and either come to the museum and look at these works in person and, as one might say, bliss out in the moment, in projecting yourself into these wonderful landscapes, real and imagined. But a couple things, if you enjoy these kinds of tours, we have one coming up this Sunday, the 11th at 1:30 with Laura Vookles once again, and our assistant curator, Victoria Ratchin, who are going to be taking us through our exhibition, special exhibition that just opened a couple weeks ago, that Laura mentioned, called Women to the Fore. And that is on here at the museum through January 3rd. And it features, I think, over 40 women or female identifying artists in a salute to artists who should have come to the fore much sooner. And we are doing our part to bring them to people's attention. So that's going to be at 1:30 on Sunday, and it is the first of two in a series. The next one we're planning for next month. This is really going to be about how female identifying artists have depicted their experiences and their bodies. And the next one will focus more on how other artists in the exhibition represent and relate to the world around them. So that will relate a little bit more closely to this exhibition. Also inspired by landscape art and virtual travel, and in particular by the David Hockney Grand Canyon, is a concert. This is going to be live in our courtyard on Wednesday, October 14th at 2 o'clock. It's called American Soundscapes at the HRM River to Canyon. And it is presented really by the Yonkers Chaminade Club with support from Art Bridges. And it features Corliss Euchre, that's a soprano, Jerry Grossman, Christopher Oldfather, and Anton Rist. Many of these musicians play for our first musicians for the Metropolitan Opera. So you won't want to miss that. The tickets are available on our website, and we do hope you will join us. And we're providing seats for that. So got to wear a mask, but we do provide seats. It's going to be a beautiful concert, and it will feature, among other pieces, Grofe's Grand Canyon Suite. The other connected program that is coming up this month is going to be an author talk by Dr. Catherine Manthorn on feminist artist Eliza Pratt Greatorex, as she traces the travels of a woman who was considered to be among the greatest American women in history, but has long been forgotten. And Eliza Pratt Greatorex was a very enterprising and independent woman who emigrated from Ireland and became a leader in the women's movement of the 19th century. And her work is stunning and really worth having been rediscovered. And Catherine Manthorn is a wonderful speaker. So it will be fully illustrated and also on the Zoom platform, so you can ask any questions and make any comments you like. So those are a few things that are coming up this month. Stay tuned for more. Any more questions or comments? We will look in the box. Otherwise, thank you.
If you know anybody that missed it, you can always direct them to watch it again on Facebook. Exactly. Or we also put them up on YouTube.
Yes,
all our talks we've already given are all up on YouTube and Facebook.
Yes, I was going to mention every live program that we have here on Zoom. We're also have archived in our Facebook Hudson River Museum group, which is www.facebook.com/Hudson Riv Museum. And we have art projects that are all associated with these exhibitions that we talk about in these live programs as well, including, if related to this program, especially places of interest and points of view, which was a program that our one of our educators, Bridget, put together, which was really great. And you guys can always take a look at those if you have any teens that are interested in art projects.
Mhm. So
It was
check
based
out
on
our,
Butterfield Road, right?
that's right. It's the link to it is in the chat. I put it in a little bit earlier. And it's really not just for teens. It's really for anybody interested in how artists like Marcia represent space and really learning about that process and that practice. So once again, Olivia, Laura, Marcia, audience, thank you all for being here. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Take care. Be well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And if Marcia, if you want to stay here with me and Sarah Linda for a second, we could, bid you adieu. After people